After we started talking about monitoring and controlling process group, and we've covered monitoring and controlling the project work, we've looked into the performing integrated change control, and we've talked about its importance in terms of integration with the other project activities. Now it's the time to move to the third key process group here is to validate the scope. So welcome to the session on validate the scope process. And this session will explore how project managers ensures that the deliverables meet stakeholder expectations and also obtain formal acceptance. This process is crucial in maintaining the project scope integrity and preventing unnecessary rework, which can lead to cost and schedule overruns. The validate scope process is crucial to ensure that the deliverables are accepted by the customer or sponsor based on predefined requirements. It's a formalized process of checking the project outputs against the stakeholder expectations and obtaining an official approvals. Remember that many projects fails because they skip formal, let's say, validation, leading to last minute dispute, rejected deliverables, and rework. This process, part of monitoring and controlling, let's say, process group, prevents scope creep and improves the customer satisfaction and ensures the acceptance. So by end of this video, you will understand the formal validation process, the key ITTOs involved, and the best practices to ensure a smoother, let's say, project execution. We'll also discuss how validate scope, let's say, differs from quality control and see a real world example of how organization implement the validating scope process. First, let's understand what exactly is scope validation or what is validate scope process. So, validate scope is a key process in the monitoring and controlling process group. It ensures that completed deliverables meet the customer original requirements and that they are formally also accepted as the deliverables. Unlike quality control checks whether the deliverables meet the internal quality standards. Validate scope ensures that they meet the external, let's say, holder expectation, also the overall stakeholder expectation, not only the external or internal. For example, here let's take a construction project which is aimed to deliver a new office building. Control quality ensures that the building is structured, the structure of that building structurally sound, uh, while validate the scope ensures that it meets the agreed upon design, layout, and customer preferences. Let's look here on an example of, let's say, an IT company which is developing an e-commerce solution for a client. So the QA team or the quality assurance team performs the quality control checks to ensure that there is no technical bugs, which is considered as controlling the quality process, where the QA team start doing audits and tests to the website or to the platform to ensure that it's performing no bugs with no glitches. So this is part of the quality control process group. However, before going live, the client checks the website or the platform to confirm that, let's say, the agreed upon design, features that were requested by the stakeholders, and the content match their original requirements, which is in this case, it's called the validate the scope or validating the scope. So this is the main difference between validating the scope and quality control in real world example. Now let's move to the next slide here we have is the ITTOs involved when validating the scope. So the key inputs here we have is scope, or the project management plan, including the scope and the requirements management plan that guides the validation process. We also has a key input here is the verified deliverables. Verified deliverables are can think of quality checked outputs that is ready for the stakeholder review. Also have this requirements documentation and traceability matrix. And that is an input where it ensures that all of the scope elements are validated and it's aligned with the stakeholder, let's say, requests. We also have this work performance data. The work performance data is the information on deliverables status. Okay. So these deliverable status and the defect report, it can be considered as part of the, let's say, the work performance data. Also have this, now let's move to the techniques and tools. So we have inspection and decision making as the key process or the key tools and techniques that is used when validating the scope. So inspection here, it's used like to review the deliverables through audits, walkthrough, or UAT or user acceptance testing reports. The next also technique here we have is the decision making. Decision making is like the formal approval mechanism, such as the audits, such as the voting or sign offs by the stakeholders or the consensus meetings to agree that, let's say, that all of the let's say, the project scope has been met. And the outputs here we have is the accepted deliverables, which are the formally signed off by the stakeholders. So think of a list of all of these requested deliverables where the stakeholders, you obtain a formal sign off by all of these stakeholders on delivering these deliverables. Also, you have the work performance information. The work for performance information as an output here, you can think of these reports on acceptance or rejecting rates. And one of also these important, let's say, outputs is the change requests. In case if there's any discrepancies are found, scope modification may be needed. So the validate scope process follows a structured approach using the inputs, tools, and techniques again to obtain the formal approval of the deliverables. The key input here is the verified deliverables, where we have discussed that it means that it have already passed into the internal quality checks and now it's ready for the stakeholder, let's say, validation. A common technique we have discussed here also is the user acceptance testing, which is the UAT, especially in an IT project where the client tests the system before final approval. If the deliverable meets their expectation, it's formally signed off and marked as complete. As you could see here, we have the, let's say, the accepted deliverables as one of these outputs, or the verified deliverables are in the inputs, and the outputs here are the accepted deliverables by the stakeholders as let's say, after inspection these verified deliverables. Let's have here a look on one of these ITTOs and let's say in a real world example. So let's look into a manufacturer company that delivers a 500 unit of medical device. Before the full shipment, the client inspect 20 units or at a random inspection to verify they meet the contractual specification. And if it's approved, they will accept it as the key stakeholders, and they will accept it as a full batch. In case if they found any defects, a change request may be issued to modify the production processes. What is exactly the importance of formal acceptance as part of validation or scope validation? So, formal acceptance is crucial to close the project or phase successfully. Without it, there is a risk that the stakeholder later reject the deliverables or request modification that weren't originally part of the scope. And by obtaining a formal sign off, the project teams protect itself from the scope creep where uncontrolled changes extend the project scope without a proper evaluation and proper documentation and proper, let's say, approvals. Think of the formal acceptance as it provides an official approval to avoid any disputes later on, and it ensures the stakeholders buy in before closing the project phases. And here we have an example where the formal acceptance is applied on, let's say, in a real case. So think of a marketing agency that uh, delivers a new advertising campaign, which is requested by a stakeholder. And the client or the stakeholder here signs an acceptance document confirming that the visuals, messaging, or the messages and strategy aligns with the original proposal. And that, let's say, inspection or edit, this prevents the client from requesting last minute changes without having a formal change request or formal approved change request. Now let's look into the role of stakeholder engagement in scope validation. Stakeholders, as we've discussed many times, that plays a major role in validating the scope. If they are engaged late in the process, they might reject these deliverables because they don't match their expectations. To prevent this, project managers should maintain continuous feedback loops. For example, here, think of these agile projects where you use the sprint reviews, where the stakeholders provide a feedback on completed increments. Don't worry, because we are going to discuss all of these sprint reviews, the sprint retrospectives, the sprint planning, and the increments or complete increments when we, let's say, arrive at the agile section, which is going to be at the end of this course. So we were talking about the role of stakeholder engagement in scope validation. So we took an example where sprint reviews, where the stakeholders provide a feedback on completed increment. And this helps ensuring the alignment throughout the project and reduces the surprises at the end. So again, the role of stakeholder engagement in scope validation. We talked about engaging the stakeholders early and frequently reduces the rework and also the satisfaction of these stakeholders. And think of these transparent communication to align the expectation. And by conducting regular demos, walkthrough, and milestone approvals, that will provide you and the team the clarity. Now let's see on managing the scope rejections and change requests as part of, let's say, validating the scope. So not all of the deliverables pass the validation on the first attempt. If the stakeholder reject one of these or reject all of these deliverables, the project team must initiate a change request to address the gaps. And the change control board, which is known as the CCB, evaluates the request based on the impact on scope, time, and cost before approving the modifications. Let's look here and for one of these examples on managing the scope. So let's take here an example of a construction firm that delivers a commercial office as a project. But the clients, for example, or the stakeholder finds a conference room too small after they delivered. So they have to submit a change request to expand it, expands the size of that room. After that, the project team assess the let's say the impact of this let's say size increment to the room on cost and schedule before proceeding, then obtaining the approval from the CCB or the change control board. These are the common documentation techniques for the scope validation where you have to refer. Also, you can think of these as a key inputs. So you have the requirements traceability matrix, which tracks every requirements against the deliverables. Remember when we were at the planning phase, when we talked about gathering the requirements, having all of these requirements based on stakeholders. So each of these stakeholders will have, let's say, their name under each of these requirements to trace who was the original stakeholder to that requirement. Also, you have this acceptance criteria document, which is a very, very, very important document to match or to map the, let's say, these deliverables with their acceptance criteria. And these acceptance criteria, it defines what the requirements or what will the approved deliverable looks like. Think of a checklist where all of these deliverables has to have, for example, one deliverable has to have, let's say, five acceptance criteria. For example, in a construction or an office building, you think that it needs to be, let's say, finished on time, needs to be colored on white, it needs to be, let's say, furnished. So all of these can be considered as an acceptance criteria in terms of, let's say, verifying these deliverables. So I think as one of these offers is one of these deliverables as part of the biggest project. So think of all of these deliverables will have their own acceptance criteria. So this is a very important where you as a project manager and the team has to keep verifying these deliverables whether it meets these acceptance criteria. Next, we have the formal sign-offs form, which this is to ensure the stakeholder approval is documented and to avoid any disputes later. In case if the, let's say, stakeholder has rejected any of these deliverables or has accepted it verbally and then turning off saying that, no, I haven't accepted that deliverable. So it's very important to have these formal sign off by all of these stakeholders to ensure that all of these approvals are documented and, let's say, verified. The work performance information is as a key document. We've talked many times about this work performance information, which captures the status report, acceptance, and rejection in terms of validating the scope. Common challenges that you might face when, let's say, working with scope validation and how to overcome. So, scope validation can be challenging if the requirements are unclear or ambiguous. If the requirements are not well defined, okay, at the beginning, think of that this is an integral part or where we have gathered the requirements, we have understood the deliverables. Now it's the time to validate the implementation of the requested deliverables. So if the requirements are not well defined at the beginning, stakeholders might have a different interpretations leading to rejections of these deliverables. So the key points here we have is the unclear requirements, which leads to confusion and rejections. Stakeholder alignment as one of these, misalignment as one of these challenges, and that is can be shown when there is a late stage disagreements on the deliverables. Also, the lack of formal documentation where there is no written record or scope approvals for any changes that were requested or accepted. The frequent scope changes, which is mean here, which is the uncontrolled modification leading to scope creep. And scope creep is mainly happens due to the uncontrolled changes or modification without following the change control process. And to overcome this, the project manager to, let's say, to overcome the unclear or ambiguous requirements, the project manager should ensure that the stakeholder involvement from the start till finish of the project. Also, frequent reviews, meetings, and prototype or incremental demonstration, which can help project managers to align the expectation before final validation. And when we talked about the lack of formal documentation, we talked about if the deliverable was approved verbally but not recorded. Stakeholder may later claim that it was never validated. So always as A way to overcome this challenge always ensures that the approvals are signed and documented in a centralized system to prevent any dispute later. And to avoid, again, how to avoid the scope creep or the scope changing or the scope changes or the uncontrolled scope changes where it impact the cost and resources before implementation ensures that any requested change should go through a formal change control process where you have to understand the change, you have to assess the impact you and the team on the project constraints, and then raise it to the change control board, which is the CCB, and then take the approval. Based on that, you need to update all of the project plans to accommodate these changes on impact on the constraints. Let's look here into one of these real world example in a construction project where you as a project manager were requested to build a luxury hotel. Midway through let's say the stakeholder decides they want a larger, for example, balconies or increasing the overall building footprints. If this change is not probably documented and assessed and approved, may cause, let's say, a cost overruns and dispute later with the stakeholders. And how to overcome this by using a formal change request process. Project team ensures that the scope changes are managed probably before validating the new design. Let's now look into these best practices for an effective scope validation. Successful scope, let's say, validation depends on early stakeholder involvement. And by bringing stakeholders into the review process before the deliverables are finalized, the project teams can proactively address any concerns. So think of engaging the stakeholder early and often. Next, we have to have a structured validation framework, including tools like the requirements traceability matrix, the RTM, and the user acceptance testing or the UAT and sign off documents to ensure that all of the requirements are met before the formal acceptance. Another key best practice here is to ensure measurable acceptance criteria. Deliverables should be validated based on objective standards when we talked about these acceptance criteria to each of these deliverables, not a subjective opinions. This reduces the risk of stakeholder rejecting the work due to personal preferences rather than agreed upon specifications. So make sure that these acceptance criteria is measurable and can be compared based on objective standards. Finally, you have as a best practice here is to document all of these approvals and rejections truly. If the deliverables does not meet the expectation, addressing it immediately through a change request rather than just delaying the issue until the project closure. So think of addressing all of these discrepancies immediately in case if you have discovered any, let's say, misalignment or uh, the deliverable does not meet the expectation, you need to follow the change control process. Let's now have a look on one of these financial services as a real world scenario. Let's see that, or let's think of these financial services as implementing a new CRM system. And to validate the scope effectively, they will conduct a structured user acceptance testing where the key users test the system against the predefined success criteria. Each feature is mapped into the requirements traceability matrix. Each of these requirements were requested by a certain user or a certain department or a certain group. Now it's to ensure that each of these requirements are well accepted. So they have each of these users group have to conduct user acceptance testing as part of the quality and control to ensure all of the functionalities meet the expectation. And upon the approval of these, let's say, users, formal sign-off document is obtained from these users or stakeholders or groups to ensure that there is no disputes later. The summary and takeaways here, we've discussed the formal acceptance. I know it was a long session, but it's very important topic to understand. Real world also for your PMP exam. We talked about the formal acceptance and how to validate the scope, what is the benefit to ensure the official approval of all of the deliverables and avoid any dispute later. Also, we've talked about how it's important to have an early involvement to the stakeholders to reduce the rejection risks later on. We have looked into these key ITTOs, including the verified deliverables as a key input, and we also talked about the accepted deliverables as part of the outputs of the validating the scope. We've looked into the tools and techniques, including the inspection and decision making. And we also emphasized the importance of having a proper documentation to prevent any future disputes.